from Gimv will be able to speak to the private side of finance, and Cedric will tackle the public side. And Bernard, you might recognize as a serial entrepreneur. You just took Gensight public, correct? With the help of Cedric, is that right? Okay, great. Good start today. All right, so as many of you know, last year was the worst financial year for biotech in a decade. Before the US election in November, the stock index for biotech was down by 39% in the US, and it was down by 27% in Europe. So I think, Karl, over the phone, you mentioned financial cycles. And so I wanted to get you to expand upon how, was last year the natural way of things, or were there extenuating factors or circumstances?
Yeah, so I have a bit of a more positive view with regards to the title. Of course, last year was difficult in comparison to the few years before. But if I go back 15 years when I joined the venture capital industry, I joined just after the genomics bubble. So that burst 2000, 2001. Then indices were down 70, 80%. And we entered a phase of what I call nuclear winter, where there were no early stage financings for a couple of years, at least in Europe. That was not possible at all. Indices stayed low for many years. There were no IPOs. And venture funds, biotech venture funds in Europe started to get out of biotech because they couldn't get their LPs convinced to invest into their funds anymore, and switched to medtech. So that was when I started my career. The first couple of years, we then started to look at specialty pharma, going late stage, trying to define a new asset class that is less risky and less binary than biotech. So today, that's not the situation at all. Of course, things have come down. We had, let's say, high valuations. In 2016, the post-IPO performance was okay. It was bad in 2015. That maybe explained part of the issue. We had difficult political environment. We know all of that. But after all, the indices are maybe 25% down. They're still as high as they were in 2013, 2014, or even higher. There are still IPOs. There's lots of capital available for early stage financings. People are interested in early stage, and that tells me that, yes, we have come down, but fundamentally things are still okay. I think people have realized that biotech finally delivers. You know, if you look at the large cap biotechs, they're still growing better than other sectors. If you look at the exciting products that are coming to the market, it's biotech products. They're largely still in the hands of biotech companies. So fundamentally, it's still okay, and you see that with the early stage, on the early stage financing side. Being in Germany, last year we had a huge amount of, the largest amount probably for a decade, or ever, in fact I didn't check that, of institutional venture capital money going into biotech. We haven't had as much before, I believe. And that tells you something, you know, the wheel is still turning. That's why I think it's a natural cycle that valuations come down, but you know, what is really different compared to previous bursts of bubbles is that it was maybe not a bubble, but it was a bit of, you know, heightened enthusiasm, which is now back to fair valuations.
And are the others, are you similarly optimistic, or?
I fully agree on the fact that, and particularly as a banker, 2013, 2014 for biotech was a fantastic period, and that by H2 2015 and 2016 was more difficult for sure. And mainly also because 2013-14 benefit from US investment for our European companies. And that, of course, last year in 2016, all this capital disappeared for the European companies. So it's more this basic effect, which was pretty high. Now we are coming back to a more positive trend, particularly just now. There is several deals in the pipeline. The indexes are in a positive territory from the beginning of the year. We are pretty at a high single digit for the Nasdaq Biotech and Next Biotech in Europe. So clearly we are back to a more normal and stable environment, and there is always, becoming to your point, that for good story, you mentioned that we were on the road with Bernard during the Brexit, so we wanted to price the deal just after the Remain, but unfortunately it was the Brexit. But we succeed to do it finally. And so for good story and for the fund that are specialized, so we don't have a lot in Europe, but the specialist fund could, whatever the environment, continue to back and to finance the most promising biotech and technology story.
Bernard, do you have anything to add?
Well, from the company standpoint, it's slightly a little bit more difficult probably to read what's happening. I think we are essentially, I think, yes, the situation has completely changed from the early 2000s. That is for sure. I think things are going better in Europe than they used to be, and certainly thanks to 2013, 14, mid of 15, then it stopped brutally. I think we're still lacking a number of things in Europe as compared to our US peers. I mean, you look at, I'm not a financial specialist, so I apologize, but if I look at the US, at the NASDAQ, I think the market is in fact driven by the specialist fund, but the valuation are driven by the intervention of the generalist. So when people say, okay, windows open, when windows open, in fact, essentially because the generalists are acting in the biotech field, right? And then when the windows close, generalists are just jumping out, and that's a big shrunk into valuation. But at least the biotech companies, and they're still the specialists, and the liquidity goes on. We don't have this in Europe. In Europe, we only have specialist fund driving the IPO markets and driving the market for biotech companies. So in fact, the window is I would say never completely closed, but it's really never open. And we're always fighting for this. And the readout of this is that most of the successful European companies are first listing on Euronext, and then they move to the NASDAQ as soon as they can, right? To get higher valuation, because the gap evaluation, I don't know whether you have any numbers, and don't know whether this number exists, but it's probably a factor of at least 2 to 3 on an average between European companies and their peers in the US, right?
I think you have a good example in the gene therapy space, for sure. It's clear that if you have a look and valuation of the Bluebird, the Spark, all these players in the US compare what we have in Europe, maybe we can was 3x difference between them. So that's true that I think to have as a target the Nasdaq is something that makes a lot of sense for a European company to access to this amount and capital. Having said that, I think there is have to be really well prepared. It's a lot of work, and we have to find the right time. So I think it's the reason why we have observed that the dual listing, so the access to the Nasdaq in 2 steps approach. First, to be listed in Europe, started to attract some US investors. And once you have 1 or 2 cornerstone investors from the US, you can decently really prepare a Nasdaq IPO. So it's also, maybe a first step that could be a good start, and then in the second step, access to the Nasdaq.
Could you comment on some of the drawbacks of that dual listing approach? Because GW, I can't remember when exactly, but they pulled their listing from AIM because the disparity between AIM and the Nasdaq was so great. Would you be able to expand upon that?
Drawbacks could be that it's not always easy to manage. Well, so first the cost, maybe, because it's of course more costly to be listed on 2 different places first. Secondly, sometimes you can have a bit more volatility, because of course the way your announcement will be understood in Europe, because of Bernard mentioned more generalist, and the way then the same news could be understood a few hours later in the US, could be different. So it's clear that you can have this kind of accelerated volatility on your stock price, and then internally for a company to manage all the reporting, the publication. Of course, you need to staff your company to do your job on this. So probably it needs more cost, more organization and work. But at the end of the day, I think it's something that makes sense. And we have several examples: Galapagos, Selectis, TBV today, and the stock on the both place are pretty well and it works well.
Still on the subject of IPOs, you brought up the early stage interest, which I agree is definitely there, but I think there's a more concerning bottleneck in funding, and that's in late stage funding, which an IPO might address. And Bernard, you touched on specialists versus generalist investors. There's still that, there's a couple of gaps there that I think are very much in the same space. So I was wondering if one of you wanted to pick that up from the lack of generalist investors or from the lack of late stage funding.
There's maybe another element are crossover investors, which is probably one of the reasons why you see less later stage rounds, in particular in the US right now, because the crossover funds are stuck in some of their companies that they first need to IPO before they enter into new engagements. That's anyway something we are lacking in Europe. But I wouldn't interpret the fact that there are less later stage rounds as a fear of venture capitalists to go into clinical stage stories. It's more that we have seen a good exit window for companies with strategic values through M&A. So if you enter into innovation, new hot fields, it makes sense to do that early stage because you have that strategic opportunity, which you might not have the same way in a later stage story where you have to turn the card of clinical data mostly. But then if there's an IPO window, obviously, and if in the US the crossover investors are becoming active again, I think those later stage companies will get funding again.
Bernard, it looked like you were reaching for the microphone.
No, it's true. It remains that we're lacking a growth fund for private equity in Europe. I think we don't have this. We've always, and to some extent that probably helpful for us because we're doing more with less resources. But we are certainly lacking this big injection of funding that is necessary for running a full-fledged phase 3 or an expanded phase 2 trial to get really the robust clinical result that indeed will enable us to go maybe directly to the NASDAQ or at least to really justify a high valuation. And our peers in the US they're facing a number of potential, either VC but with really large pockets or VC that are, which happens more and more to seem to be the direction that the VC funds are taking in Europe. I mean, they start looking at how can we build crossover funds, how can we build IPO funds aside from or parallel to our classical VC fund. But that's really a very recent movement, and I know Antoine is speaking after, but I know they are at Sofinova, for instance, they are in doing this. And I think this is really something that is likely to help us and really change the scope of what's happening in Europe, maybe enabling us to have really big success story from Europe, probably with a foot somewhere in the US, but at least really pushing the biotech sector forward with a couple of champions.
Yeah, no, I think it's completely true. The fact that is we have, I think, in terms of early stage financing for Series A, B, we have access to capital, to grants, and so we have the support. But it's clear that the main difference is the more late stage financing, and we have a lack. And when you have a deal in terms of placement, that's true that we have some difficulties to find this deep pocket in Europe to back our European companies and to accelerate and to have this access to growth capital. So probably because we don't have still a big success in Europe. I mentioned Galapagos, I think is 4 billion. So we have Genmab, we have DBV, we have these kind of companies, but it's not still really a super M&A exit or real truly move towards a true specialty pharma. So I think we need to have this champion. So they are emerging, which is good. And then absolutely we have to build this larger base of fund, specialist fund with deeper pockets. But I'm optimistic we will come. But it's clearly the next step for us, because in terms of market, if we have a look on the dynamism of a market, and particularly I'm based in Paris, Euronext Paris is very active. If we have a look at 6-7 years ago, we have 2, 3, 4 companies. Today we are 80, 90 medtech, biotech companies to be listed. So it's starting, but yeah, clearly we need more fun. There are initiatives, and I think it's a good way.
So with 2 Frenchmen on the panel and your bringing up of Euronext, it seems like France is doing some things particularly well with Euronext, but also with the incentives for generalist investors. I was wondering if either of you could elaborate on that and why France, and if that's helped France become a leader.
Well, maybe I'm not the best place to respond to this question. I think there's certainly the conjunction of a number of parameters. There's been an ecosystem for starting biotech company in France that is fairly good. We have access to research tax credit, which is paid in cash. We have access to a number of things like this. We have an organism which is a state-owned bank called BPI France, which is in fact playing the role of not only investing in early stage, but also they have several funds. One is called Large Venture. And they are playing the role of this big pocket that could do some crossover, could also be present for the IPO of the French company. And I think this results indeed, because this effort has started years ago. I mean, it's been implemented gradually. The BPI France was created in 2012, if I remember well. And so now you start seeing the results of a number of companies being listed. It's still difficult. I mean, don't take me wrong. I mean, we're not in a heaven somewhere and everything's nice and flowers and peace. Not at all. But at least things are doing well. However, BPI France cannot do this alone. I mean, and so we need now the pump to turn and to have additional funds getting this. Once we will have funds, I mean, maybe we'll benefit from the Brexit and get some additional strengths from the city. I mean, financial banks, analysts jumping into the Paris market and helping this market grow, and then maybe we'll attract generalist fund at the end. So that is probably a kind of an utopic type of story. But yes, I think this is the conjunction of these elements, really a long-term policy, the help of the public funds to grow the sector, and then normally there should be some virtuous circle here.
Having worked in France, although I'm not French, I can only testify that those different elements which you find on the company level, on the fund level, and BPI then supporting as well directly the companies, as well as CDC and BPF supported the funds. We don't have that in Germany the same way. I mean, it's also just starting now, and hopefully we will see the fruits in a couple of years as we see them in France, but it's not as broad, it's not as deep. The amount of, let's call it state money in a German biotech company is far lower than what you would see in France, and it's not a criticism. I think it's something that has worked out very nicely, and it's a good example of industry politics that works.
And by the way, I believe it would work probably better if this would be run at the European level, because I mean, running this on a country-by-country basis is probably a recipe for also a big failure at the end. So moving this to the European level, I mean, there's one marketplace in the US. I mean, this is the Nasdaq. I think we have some attempt to have several Euronext places in the late 90s, early 2000. I think that was a mistake. I think we need to have one place. I personally don't care whether it's Paris or Brussels or wherever, but I think one unique place will be fine.
Also, so last question before we take questions from the audience, but going back to cycles and as well as with politics, it seems like the industry is breathing a sigh of relief with Donald Trump, not with Brexit, but with Macron. How does everything look now?
Now, what I mentioned is that if we, now, currently I think we had the French election very recently, and I think Bernard talked about window, but today we have a window for equity capital market activity in biotech. I know from my colleagues and myself that the numbers of projects and potential deal before the summer break is particularly huge, and really there is an acceleration of the appetite, which is I think a good thing. We talk also about what happened with the indexes, but it is true that the valuation now come back, so more fair valuation. So it offers some opportunities, and we see the comeback from US investors too, that looking at more and more the European companies, and we are still a big gap in terms of valuation. So it's really attractive for them. And once again, it's where the deep pocket are. So I'm very positive from now until the break summer, so in the coming weeks, I would say. And then, of course, we have the German election, the Italian election, but I think we are pretty immunized against all these potential macroeconomic events. Once again, what is the value of a biotech? It's just to make the development progressing and not really sensitive to any macroeconomic aspects. So I think we just need to keep this momentum, and what I mentioned, to have good news from our champions. So for example, if I take the example of France, we have two important companies, GBV and Selectis, that has to publish important data by the end of the year. So it's clear that if our champions can deliver, they will drag all the rest, and I think it's what is more important for the biotech ecosystem.
Okay, maybe if I think about politics, there's of course macro events which we cannot control, but where hopefully biotech is less exposed than other sectors. However, there's some industry-specific issues that will become more and more pertinent. I mean, why did the Nasdaq Biotech Index go down so sharply after Trump said that drug prices, after all, are maybe still too high? There's a fundamental issue, and we have the cases of Valiant and Scrady, and they're really putting a bad image on the sector, but behind that, there's a fundamental issue that we are facing over the next couple of years. And if I look at an investment case, I don't worry about Macron or Theresa May or whatever. I worry about will this be paid for, and will this company be acquired in a couple of years when maybe this approach proves to be too expensive for the market.
Yeah, maybe another comment is, which is not intuitive, is that with this pricing pressure, I would say, topic, and particularly for the healthcare, pharma, and biotech industry, the main outcome we have today is what are the companies that suffer the most? Is it the biotech sector? The answer is not. Is it the big pharma sector? No, they are performing very well. The first sector impacted is the generic. If you have a look on Teva, for example, in year to date, they are probably at minus 45%. So, yeah, once again, probably all this topic, even if a very spread and debate pricing pressure topic in the healthcare industry, in terms of outcome, probably is not what we anticipated some months ago. So, once again, it's story by story, and innovation is still protected at this stage.
Okay, any questions from the audience? Nobody. Ah, good.
I think I really enjoyed the conversation. I think it's the right time and the right conversation and compliments to Labiotech team. It's wonderful. I'm really fascinated. The question is about the German ecosystem, and I'm working on this ecosystem actively as a previous clinician scientist, right now as a change maker. Why do we have so little business angels investing in the early stage companies? We have great initiatives providing funding for early stage companies coming from the federal government, you know, these Go Bio initiatives and so on. But why do we have I appreciate the German ecosystem for biotech is still not mature in comparison to French and other ecosystem, but so little early investment coming from business angels, and then also restrictions coming also from the US market. US investors are not much interested in investing in the early stage biotech companies. This is also making a huge difference, huge impact. How we can change this situation? What do you think? Thank you.
You know, my take on this, should a business angel invest in the classical biotech startup if it's an early stage situation? Does he have the ammunition to carry on to protect his equity? It needs to be somebody who has very deep pockets, and this we have. We have family offices, we have the Stringmans, the Hobbs, those who really have deep pockets. They're doing it quite successfully, so that makes sense. Would I encourage somebody who made some money in the industry to get into early stage venture and biotech? It's maybe not the right sector for this.
Well, I don't know the situation in Germany, but if you look at France, I mean, there's still not an awful lot of US investors coming in to invest in France, and certainly not in the early stage. But how would you want them to come to France? I mean, in the US, I mean, those investors in the Boston area and in San Francisco, I mean, they would find next door what the innovation they need. So I think for the early stage investment, we should not really look at this. It's more when you're getting into late stage where this becomes a more international market, where investors could come across the ocean and truly just take their chance and bid on the European technology or European companies rather than the early stage. Right? In the early stage, I mean, we need to have a local ecosystem. And my last consideration would be, I think we should really push forward to have this consideration at the European level. I mean, having a French ecosystem and the German ecosystem and the Belgian ecosystem, whatever, I don't think this is the best solution for the biotech. So, but I mean, we need to start somewhere.
If I can follow up on this, I just have a most concrete example coming from my colleagues working a spin-off company from Pharmaceutical Institute at Berlin-Buch, FMP, which belongs to Leibniz Institute. They were looking for, they working on specific compound and then to put it in a particular treatment. So I don't go to elaborate on details, but they were looking at $1 million investment to cover the cost or provide the specific in vivo trials. So on the mind can't just fall beyond who can invest in this. So in Germany, there is no much companies, investment companies who can provide those funds to cover those costs for early stage, especially in biotech and pharma company. I completely agree with you, Bernard. I think we living in a single market, we do need a communication and one particular ecosystem, one particular platform, which can allow the investment all around the system and without restrictions, and hoping that all those markets, European markets, can definitely benefit from this single market investment. But how and when and who will do that? This is the question. Thank you.
That will maybe help another issue, because there is funding available, HTGF, there's some other fund initiatives in Germany for these types of situations. But what is really lacking, in my opinion, is a global scope, very sophisticated investor being very close to the companies and making them from the start very successful. And we have that in France, we have that in Switzerland, we used to have that in Germany. But if you look now, where's most of the institutional VC money coming from in Germany? It's Belgian funds, it's Dutch funds. There's no strong, maybe Wellington, yeah, but there's no strong local investor that is proximal, starts early to put the companies from the start into the right direction. That's really what's missing, and maybe a more European-wide initiative will help to create those funds that can then be the counterparts for US investors that come in later. They will always look at the local lead.
All right, sorry to pressure you all.
Sorry, we have to. I'm sorry to cut you short, but we're running behind a little bit, and I'm sure everyone wants to get to the drinks. Last words?
Nope, that's it.
Thank you very much, everyone.